and welcome to this special occasion for the Arts and Humanities Initiative, Mellon Grant. We're really honored to welcome this evening such a prominent scholar of international renown, a prolific writer, and a dedicated teacher, Professor Rashid Khalidi, who is a distinguished guest, who is the distinguished guest of the Arts and Humanities Initiative for this academic year. Professor Khalidi is very active, not only at Columbia, his home university, and in the United States, but also in Europe, and especially in the Middle East. He is Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia and is editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. He was also president of the Middle East Studies Association in the United States of America and an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli peace negotiations from October 1991 until June 1993. Professor Khalidi is author of numerous books, of which I mention only a few. Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East, this is Boston, 2013. Sowing Crisis, American Dominance and the Cold War in the Middle East, 2009. The Iron Cage, The Story of the Palestinian Struggle for Statehood, 2006. Resurrecting Empire, Western Footprints and America's Perilous Path in the Middle East, 2004. Palestinian Identity, The Construction of Modern National Consciousness, 1996. Under Siege, PLO, Decision Making During the 1982 War, 1986. And finally, in my list at least, British Policy Towards Syria and Palestine, 1906-1914. This was published in 1980. Professor Khalidi is also co-editor of 3 scholarly publications and has published dozens of articles and chapters in books. We were honored at AHI to have Professor Khalidi give a seminar on February 17, 2015, some weeks ago, on nationalism, identity, and the nation state in the Middle East. It was very successful with a young crowd of students. In addition to his scholarly work, Professor Khalidi is a passionate teacher and a caring mentor. He is very concerned about his students, and many of his students are teaching with us at UB, have been teaching and are still teaching. His talk today is entitled Unhealed Wounds of World War I, Armenia, Kurdistan and Palestine. Please welcome with me Professor Khalidi.
Masa al-Khair, good evening everybody. It's always a pleasure to speak at AUB. And it's a particular pleasure to me to be the guest of the Arts and Humanities Institute. I don't call it AHI because AHI is a form of tuna, and it sounds wrong to me. So the Arts and Humanities Institute. So I want to thank the provost, I want to thank Maher, I want to thank everybody who welcomed me here, including, as Maher mentioned, some of my former students who teach here. The only unmitigated good about teaching for as long as I've taught is that you finally see some of your students develop into, colleagues, and that is an unmitigated pleasure. My topic this evening is not an unmitigated pleasure. My topic this evening is a very painful one. It's the unhealed wounds of World War I, and my focus is going to be on Armenia, Kurdistan, and Palestine. It's based on a lecture that I gave at Harvard as part of the Hrant Dink Memorial Lecture Series there. As all of you know, last year marked the centenary of the 100-year anniversary, in other words, of the beginning of the First World War. When we think of this destructive conflict, wherein the most modern industrial means of the beginning of the 20th century were used to take over 15 million lives, we primarily think of the trenches of the Western Front. That's the image we mainly have of World War I. It was in those trenches that most of the battlefield casualties were suffered. It was there that lethal innovations, which we've all come to know much more about, unfortunately, poison gas, aerial bombardment, the use of armored weapons, were first previewed on a massive scale. We know that this terrible war traumatized the European societies that were in it for centuries. Some of them are still traumatized to this day, I would argue. We also know that this war redrew the map of Central and Eastern Europe. It brought down three great European dynasties, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and the Hohenzollerns, and it helped bring the Bolsheviks to power in Russia. Everybody knows this, the world over. But less attention, the world over, has been given to the fact that although the main protagonists and the main theaters of combat were European, World War I was not only a European war. It was, in fact, a world war. It was fought across, in addition to Europe, it was fought across large swaths of the seas, large parts of Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Indeed, of all the major combatant nations, the highest proportion of military and civilian wartime casualties was suffered by the population of a mainly non-European state. This was the Ottoman Empire. As much as 15% of the Ottoman Empire's total population, 3 million people, perished during World War I. Just for purposes of comparison, the next highest proportions among all combatant nations were for France and Germany. During the war, each lost about 4% of its population. The Ottoman Empire lost 15%. The horrific casualties among the peoples of the Ottoman Empire, and I'm going to come back to the grim peculiarities of these losses. The horrific casualties among the peoples of the empire are only one reason for paying attention to the extra-European aspects of World War I. Another is that among the forces of the Entente powers, in particular, were hundreds of thousands of colonial soldiers. In fact, probably over 1 million in total. Some of them were from the so-called white colonies like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa, but some were from the British and French colonial armies that were raised among the subject peoples of India, of North Africa, and of West Africa, and other regions of the globe. Historians of decolonization have traced the beginnings of nationalist demands in these non-white colonies after World War I, in part to the exposure of Arab and African colonial soldiers to the horrors of this war. This nationalist reaction was also due to these soldiers' discriminatory treatment by the white European powers in spite of the great sacrifices many of them made on the battlefield. This discrimination continued through World War II, when very large parts of the British and French armies were made up of non-white colonials. The French government, only under the presidency of President Chirac, finally paid non-Franco-Francais veterans of World War II the same pensions as the Franco-Francais, the real French veterans, got. So this happened within the last 15 years. So that discrimination continued. These are sensitive issues to this day. I've mentioned this issue of pensions. There was intense controversy in both France and Algeria over the Bastille Day parade in Paris on July 14th, 2014, in which for the first time Algerian soldiers took part, alongside others from countries whose soldiers also took part in World War I. There were protests in Algeria, there were protests in France against the participation of Algerians. The Algerians who marched in Paris this summer represented 175 of their compatriots, Algerians, the equivalent of 12 divisions of infantry, who fought and died for France starting a little more than 100 years ago in the trenches on the Western Front. So that's one reason that the extra-European aspects of World War I are important. Among other reasons for this importance, I think several seem particularly pertinent today. These have to do with my main topic, what I call the unhealed wounds of World War I. in particular the wounds of Armenia, Kurdistan, and Palestine. If you look at Western Europe today, you will see that some of the main enmities which helped to produce 3 wars between 1870 and 1945, the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, and World War II, have ended. The French and the Germans are not enemies anymore. Indeed, a desire to avoid the recurrence of such wars was central to the creation of the European Union and its predecessors. As the EU has expanded, it has helped to provide a sense of closure in some of these troubled regions of Europe, although obviously not in all of them. Now, in the Middle East, there has been no such sense of closure. There has been no such resolution of enmities as we've seen between France and Germany, for example. In the Middle East, the borders created by the victors of World War I and its sanguinary post-war sequels are still a source of vigorous and sometimes violent contestation. These imposed borders and the artificial nature of the states created within them have produced periodic conflicts between states and civil wars within others. You all probably are as aware as I am of some of these conflicts, the Kurdish insurgencies in Turkey and Iraq, some aspects of the civil war in this country, the war over Kuwait in 1990-91, and obviously the 100-year struggle over Palestine. All of these are, in some respects, rooted in the creation of these artificial borders after World War I. Perhaps the most dramatic recent example of such contestation in other words of these borders, has been the categorical, explicit rejection by the so-called Islamic State, الدولة الإسلامية في العراق والمشرق, which has rejected the borders between Iraq and Syria and other inter-Arab borders. This state, so-called state, purports to transcend and to erase these hated borders. Some of you may have seen in June of 2014, right after this state proclaimed a revived Islamic caliphate encompassing these 2 countries and claiming the territory of many others and pronouncing its sovereignty over all Muslims. I know everybody pays attention to this here. This is not the first instance in modern Arab history of the rejection of these artificial European-drawn borders, but it was certainly the most radical one. Some of you may also have seen one of the first announcements of the new so-called Islamic State. This was an English and Arabic language video, very professionally produced, as with all of the productions of Daesh, which is a postmodern state in the way in which it uses the media, by the way. This video showed the dynamiting of a recently captured border post between Iraq and Syria. And so what they were showing is, in concrete terms, by blowing up concrete, how they were erasing these hated frontiers that others had failed to erase. As we know, Iraq and Syria are only 2 of the states created by the Sykes-Picot partitions, whereby Britain and France, as we know, drew long lines in the desert essentially to suit their own interests, with no reference to local conditions or the wishes of those affected. These borders, as we also know, became the nuclei of at least 5 of the existing states of the Middle East today. But I'm arguing this evening that this is important, but in a sense it's not as important as what I want to talk about. Because I think that the impact of World War I goes far, far beyond the capricious imposition of borders and the creation of artificial states by greedy, grasping imperial powers. While grievances persist as a result of these partitions carried out by colonialism, in other areas, similar grievances have been largely overcome. In fact, like scores of nation-states in Africa and Asia that are in whole or in part the questionable creations of colonial mapmakers, many such Middle Eastern states have taken on a life of their own. They are among the numerous examples of the way in which, in post-colonial situations, the state left behind by the colonial power, however artificial, eventually plays a part in engendering a new nation. Lebanon, by the way, is one of them. My focus in this talk will not be on the impact of these colonial experiments in creating new states. It will be rather on the cases where people were not allowed to form the states that they wanted, where nation states were prevented from developing, and where a sequence of tragic events during and after the war has continued to have repercussions until today, leaving behind wounds that are still unhealed. Let me turn to those wounds. Now, these cases are those, obviously, of the Armenian people, the Kurdish people, and the Palestinian people. Each is different from the other, and the national movement of each has its own history, which is unique, and its own specificities. Each people is obviously facing quite a different situation today. What they share, however, is a common World War I experience of cruel disappointment of their hopes for independent development as peoples. In spite of various solemn commitments offered by the victors of World War I, notably by Great Britain, in the end, none of these commitments were honored, and these three peoples ended up among the greatest losers of the post-war settlement in the Middle East. Let me take first the case which is the most tragic, and at the same time, the only one in which the people in question has managed to achieve full independence and self-determination, however precarious. This is the Armenian case. It's the most tragic because during World War I, the Armenian people suffered the most of the three peoples I'm discussing, located as they were in the midst of an epic series of battles between the Ottoman and Russian armies, and then being subjected to a genocide and to exile from most of their ancestral homeland. During this genocide, as many as 1.5 million of their people were slaughtered. I cannot this evening discuss in any detail the wartime circumstances that led the leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress, who controlled the Ottoman Empire at that time, to perceive the Armenian people as an enemy of the state that had to be extirpated. This is a subject that is rich and important, but I can't go into the details this evening. Obviously, such a discussion would neither justify nor extenuate the crime of genocide that was committed. But what I do want to touch on is the deeper and more complex historical context here, which I think is more nuanced than many people are prepared to admit, on both sides of what has become a great historical divide over what happened. And I think we should know by now what happened. It's pretty clear. But let's leave that aside for the moment. At the same time as this outcome constitutes the most tragic of the three I will be discussing, it is also the only one that resulted in any form of independence on any part of the homeland of the people in question. Neither the Kurds nor the Palestinians have a fully independent and recognized state today, unlike the Armenians. But we have to look carefully at what happened to the Armenians, because Armenian independence was gained only in part of the homeland that Armenians consider their own, but which, of course, historically they shared with other peoples, including Turks, Kurds, and Arabs. And it was only gained after the most awful sacrifices in the post-World War I era, as the nascent Armenian state had to fight desperately for its very existence, eventually to be swallowed up by the Soviet Empire as the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. Only after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union did a truly independent Armenia finally see the light. Now, most of you know this history. What I want to do is add a chapter that complicates this story and links it integrally to the other two stories I want to recount. This story involves the role of Great Britain, Russia, Germany, and other imperialist European powers during and after World War I in exacerbating the plight of the Armenian people. This does not in any way lighten the responsibility of the Ottoman Empire, but this is important, I think. Tsarist Russia, for example, treated the Armenians as pawns. The Russians claimed that they were coming to Eastern Anatolia to liberate the Armenians, and they used the Armenians as auxiliaries of their military forces as their troops advanced into the territory of the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, the real aim of the Russians was not to liberate anybody. The real aim of the Tsarist Empire was to expand its imperial domains further southwards. However, when Russian troops withdrew after their initial advances, they callously exposed the innocent Armenian civilian population of Eastern Armenia, of Eastern Anatolia, of Armenia, of Eastern Anatolia, and Armenians elsewhere in the empire to the vengeance of the CUP regime, which took the decisions that we now know about to extirpate them. Similarly, Imperial Germany, which was allied to the Ottomans, did absolutely nothing to protect the Armenians when the Ottoman army, which I remind you, was advised and in some areas commanded by German officers, when the Ottoman army, commanded in some cases by Germans, advanced eastward and retook Ottoman territory from the retreating Russians in 1915. When the Ottoman army advanced, the advancing troops wreaked havoc on the defenseless Armenian population, who were treated as collaborators with the Russian enemy. The Germans did absolutely nothing to stop the resulting genocide, either there or elsewhere in the Ottoman domains. We see from the German diplomatic correspondence that German commanders were reporting what was happening. Germany did nothing. Clearly, the German alliance with the Ottomans was too important to German imperial interests for them to try and stop the genocide. Finally, as always in the Middle East, there is Britain. Anytime anything really bad happens here in the last century and a little more, usually you find the British somewhere. And here you find the British as well. Britain witnessed these agonizing episodes at a distance during the war. There was no embassy, there were no consulates, they had spies, they knew. Afterwards, when British forces and those of Britain's allies were in occupation of Istanbul and of large swaths of Ottoman territory, Britain made far-reaching promises to the Armenians. These promises included Britain's commitment to support an independent Armenia on extensive territories that were historically Armenian and that had belonged to the Ottoman Empire. Britain, too, was acting in furtherance of its own imperial interests, and for them, too, the Armenians were no more than a pawn in their game. The British Empire had no more concern for the Armenian people per se than had the Russian Empire or the German Empire. And as British statesmen showed repeatedly at the Versailles Peace Conference and afterwards, they were far from being apostles of the self-determination of oppressed peoples. Indeed, in the spring of 1919, as British statesmen were making empty promises to the Armenians, at the very same time, British troops were busy shooting down Indian and German demonstrators who were demanding self-determination and freedom in places like Amritsar and Cairo and Alexandria, all over India and Egypt. Soon after the end of World War I, in reaction to the impositions of the imperialist European powers, and in response to the hideous human and material losses that the Ottoman Empire had suffered, over 1.5 million Ottoman subjects perished during the war, in addition to the 1.5 million Armenians who were slaughtered in the genocide. In response to all of this, the beginnings or the precursors of the Turkish Republic rose. With their capital or their center in Ankara, the Republicans quickly rallied much of the population and the remnants of the Ottoman army and bureaucracy to the Turkish national cause. They were successful. Turkish national forces began to push back the Allied armies, first defeating the French in Cilicia, in Iskenderun, in Adana, and then defeating the Greeks, and finally defeating the British, and at the very end, turning their attention to Armenia. Chasing each of these foreign powers, as well as the Armenians, from what became the territory of the Turkish Republic. When this happened to the Armenians, the British did not lift a finger. These were their erstwhile allies. This was a power to which they had made commitments. The British did nothing, and the Armenians suffered the cruel consequences. A small state of Armenia survived on a very tiny parcel of territory that had always been inhabited by Armenians, as I've said, first as part of the USSR, and now as an independent but impoverished, embattled, and landlocked state. This state and Armenians everywhere are still living with the traumas that date back to World War I. These are not just the traumas of genocide, these are also the traumas of betrayal. And as I will try and argue at the end, traumas resulting from denial of their suffering. Let me turn now to the second case I wish to discuss this evening. The Kurds constitute a very different case from those of both the Armenians and the Palestinians. The Kurds are an ancient people. We all know, if we know any of our own history, that they date back at least to the time of Salah ad-Din, who of course we all know was a Kurd, and in fact to before that. But the Kurdish national movement was much later in developing than those of the Turks, the Arabs, the Armenians, and other peoples of the Ottoman Empire. Historically, Kurds lived in many areas among populations of other ethnicities who spoke other languages. When World War I broke out, the Kurdish language had not yet been modernized or homogenized or unified, as had already by this stage to a large extent been Turkish or Arabic or Armenian. Nevertheless, Kurdish nationalism had already begun to develop in the pre-war period with clubs, newspapers, secret societies, and all the other early precursors of a modern national movement, very much like Turkish nationalism, Armenian nationalism, or Arab nationalism. When the war ended, though a little later in developing, when the war ended, with President Wilson's proclamation of the principle of national self-determination, many Kurds, like others, believed that the moment of national independence had dawned. Remarkably, when representatives of the Kurdish people appealed to the British to support their demands for independence, British officials responded positively. They made promises to the Kurds that were very similar to the promises that were made to the Armenians. Indeed, by several historical accounts, the British promised to the Kurds some of the same regions that they had already promised to the Armenians. There's a pattern here. It shouldn't surprise us. Another instance of similar British duplicity in making contradictory promises to different parties in the Middle East, in this case to the Arabs, the French, and the Zionists, has led Palestine to be described as the thrice promised land. In other words, the British promised Palestine to 3 different parties. They only promised parts of Anatolia to 2. The end result for the Kurds, however, was the same as for the Armenians, the end result of these promises. When the moment of truth arrived, and the British commitment to support them was tested as Turkish nationalist forces expanded their area of control in eastern Anatolia to include areas claimed by the Kurds and which the British had promised as part of an independent Kurdish state, the British did nothing. Thereafter, the chimera of Kurdish independence vanished for decades. Like the Armenians before them, in vain did Kurdish representatives put their case before the Versailles Peace Conference, which simply ignored these claims and those of most other peoples in similar situations. In the end, as we know, Kurdistan was partitioned between independent Iran and Turkey, British-controlled Iraq, and French-controlled Syria. And as we also know, most Kurds today live in those 4 states. Their history since then has been one of struggle to maintain and develop their national identity, to unify a deeply divided national movement, and to avoid becoming pawns of the powers that succeeded the great imperialist European states. The Kurds revolted many times against the national oppression they were subjected to, first in Turkey during the interwar period, and then again in more recent years, and then also repeatedly in Iraq in the decades after World War II. Again and again, the Kurds were cruelly abandoned by powers that had been happy to support them in furtherance of their own aims. These powers included both the Soviet Union and the United States. Thus, the short-lived Kurdish Mahabad Republic, which was founded in northwestern Iran in 1945, and which was an attempt at a Kurdish independent republic, was abandoned by its Soviet backers in 1946 as soon as they reached a deal with Britain and the United States for the withdrawal of foreign forces from Iran. The Kurds were abandoned, the leaders of the republic were executed by the Iranians or escaped to fight another day. One of them who escaped was the Minister of Defense. Do any of you know who that was? That was Mullah Mustafa Barzani, father of Masoud Barzani. Similarly to the Soviets, the Americans, which with Iran and Israel had backed a Kurdish revolt against Iraq in the 1970s, immediately abandoned the Kurds when the United States' ally Iran made an advantageous deal with Iraq in Algiers in 1975. This was the occasion for the immortal words of Dr. Henry Kissinger, who, speaking to a horrified aide who remonstrated with him about this betrayal of the Kurds. The United States had supported the Kurds, and as soon as Iran made a deal with Iraq, the United States abandoned them. And so when one of his assistants said to him, "Dr. Kissinger, how can you do this?" He said, and I quote, I can't imitate his accent, but covert action should not be confused with missionary work. Henry Kissinger. There have been many other such betrayals of the Kurds and many other similar abandonments. To this day, they are largely dependent on the kindness of untrustworthy strangers for such autonomy as they've been able to secure, as in northern Iraq since the 1991 war over Kuwait. More recently, Kurds have achieved precarious autonomy, as we know, in areas of Iraq and northern Syria, as these two states have disintegrated under the pressure of sectarian civil wars. We know, but I promise you very few people in the United States know, that the sectarian civil war that's been taking place in Iraq since 2003 was in fact provoked by the American occupation of Iraq, by the American dismantling of the Iraqi state, by American imposition of a sectarian constitution, and by the installation of a perverse and vindictive Shia-dominated regime. All of this courtesy of the occupation. It also resulted in a further degree of Kurdish autonomy. But this precarious Kurdish autonomy, there and elsewhere, is threatened by a shared suspicion of Kurdish national claims by all the states in which the Kurds live, whether it's Turkey or Iran, whether it's Iraq or Syria. Kurdish autonomy is threatened as well by the fickleness of would-be allies like the United States or Israel or other powers that profess sympathy for them, but show the inconstancy of Machiavellian powers at all times and all places. Most seriously today, this autonomy is threatened by the establishment of the Islamic State, the Daesh state, which abhors the nationalism of the Kurds, as it abhors all nationalisms, Arab, Turkish, all nationalism. This nationalism itself is an affront to the transnational Islamic sovereignty that this would-be state proclaims, just as partisans of this radical new state abhor the secularism of the political movements that incarnate Kurdish nationalism, and always have. Like Armenia, Kurdistan is landlocked, it's embattled, and it faces a highly uncertain future, as it has ever since World War I. This brings me finally to the case of Palestine. Now, I've already spoken for a while. I haven't a huge amount of time, but in the time remaining, I can only sketch out some of the ways in which this, too, constitutes one of the unhealed traumas of World War I. World War I is when this trauma really begins. Zionism begins before this. The conflict began a little bit before this. But it was nothing compared to what developed out of and because of World War I, which is why I argue it is one of the unhealed wounds of World War I. In the case of the Palestinians, we have another people to whom pledges were made by Britain during World War I. Here, too, we have betrayal, as the fine words of wartime British promises of Arab independence, as set down in the Hussein McMahon correspondence, and several other public and private pledges were shown to be hollow in Palestine as elsewhere. However, in the case of Palestine, it was not only Britain, but the entire League of Nations, the entire international community of the day, that made commitments that were not kept. These pledges were enshrined in the Covenant of the League of Nations, which in its Article 22 described the former Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire as territories whose, quote, existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized. So it's not just the British promised independence. The world, the international body of its day, promised the Arabs, not just the Palestinians, independence. Insofar as Palestine was concerned, this commitment had previously already been flatly contradicted before the covenant was adopted by the Balfour Declaration, issued in November 1917, which proclaimed that there was only one people with national rights in Palestine, which was the Jewish people. The declaration further specified that the overwhelming majority of the population of Palestine, 92% Arabs, whom it did not name or describe except as non-Jews. So 92% of the population are just non-Jews. They don't have a name. They don't have an identity. They're not a nation. They don't have national rights. These people, this lot, them, were only to enjoy civil and religious rights. That's the Balfour Declaration. They were not, in other words, to enjoy political or national rights. That was a British declaration. That was a statement by the British cabinet, which was given to Lord Rothschild, representing the Zionist movement at the time. This same language of the Balfour Declaration was incorporated verbatim, word for word, into the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. This made it an international document. This made it the governing document of Palestine until the end of the League of Nations in World War II. And this document thereby denied the Palestinian Arab majority of the population. It was a majority in 1917. It continued to be a majority until 1948. It denied this majority in violation of the principle of self-determination, the very right of independence that Britain and the Allied powers and the League of Nations itself had promised to the Palestinians and to other Arab peoples. Now, the British love to portray themselves as beleaguered in Palestine by disputing Semites, as an honest broker trying in a cool, calm, very British way to keep these swarthy adversaries apart. And the British claim to not fully have understood perhaps some of the passions involved, but the British in fact knew perfectly well what they were doing. In a memo that remained secret for decades, it was only published in the 1950s, Lord Balfour wrote to Lord Curzon in 1919, and I'm quoting, "So far as Palestine is concerned, the powers have made no statement of fact which is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy which, at least in the letter, they have not always intended to violate." So the British knew what they were doing. They knew perfectly well what they were doing. They didn't, by the way, violate the statement of policy embodied in the Balfour Declaration. That's an exception. So I would argue that this is the origin of the long odyssey of the Palestinians. It's not a conflict from time immemorial. It's a conflict that really takes its starting point with the Balfour Declaration. It was exacerbated by the policies of the British colonial authorities in the interwar period in fulfillment of commitments that had been made to political Zionism in the Balfour Declaration and in the Mandate for Palestine. These commitments were kept to the letter. The harm done to the Palestinians was then compounded by another instance of the international community, the United Nations General Assembly. This august body, under American and Soviet pressure, in November 1947, voted to partition Palestine and give most of the country to, turn most of the country into a Jewish state for the Zionist-led minority. They were 30-odd% of the population at the time, and they owned less than 7% of the land at the time. They got the lion's share of the country, all the good bits. The United States and the Soviet Union, the superpowers that had pushed for the passage of the partition resolution, then abandoned the Palestinian Arab state that was also supposed to be established by this resolution. The partition resolution was to have established a Jewish state in most of the territory, an Arab state in a smaller part of the territory, and an internationalized corpus separatum around Jerusalem. This Arab state was in effect strangled in the cradle. It was strangled in its cradle by a combination of the might of the new Israeli state, the collusion of Jordan and Britain, and the indifference of the United States and the Soviet Union. These two powers were much more concerned with their rivalries with one another and with supplanting the declining power of Britain than they were with the fate of the Palestinians. Now, as a historian of Palestine who's written a good bit about some of this, I could provide much more detail on the specific traumas suffered by the Palestinians, who, like the Armenians and the Kurds, stand out as among the greatest losers of World War I and its aftermath. I think this is probably familiar to much of this audience. I will not belabor it. But let me conclude with one more common characteristic of all three of these peoples that I've described as the great losers of World War I. All of them suffer not only from the consequences of the specific traumatic events that I have traced that are rooted in World War I and its sequels. They suffer as well from something that has caused these wounds to remain raw. This is the impact on all three peoples of systematic denial of what has been done to them, combined with systematic efforts at erasure of these peoples from history. So they did not just suffer betrayal and abandonment. They did not just suffer, in the case of the Armenians, genocide, or in the case of the Palestinians, ethnic cleansing, in the case of all of them, various traumatic events. They have also suffered from denial that anything of this happened by the powers that be, and efforts to erase their existence from history. Armenians, Kurds, and Palestinians have thus been victims not only of specific material indignities of wide-scale massacres, organized ethnic cleansing, displacements, and so on. The effects of all of these hurts has been amplified and has been made to resonate generation after generation. We're now almost 5 generations from these events, by the denial by several of the powerful states that dominate the world and that dominate the Middle East for most of the past century, notably Turkey, Iraq, and Israel, and by their great power backers, that these things even happened. Denial of the genocide perpetrated against the Armenians and of the cruelties inflicted on the Kurds, of the Nakba suffered by the Palestinians, has in fact become a high art. There are denialists of the highest order. In some countries, such as Turkey, even mentioning such things can lead to legal sanction. And there are places where events that try to describe the Nakba will be shut down because they're seen as anti-Semitic or otherwise untrue and dangerous to discuss. Adding insult to injury, the testimony of the victims, of the survivors, of the refugees of all of these traumas has been largely ignored as history has been written mainly by the victors. Worse, if worse was possible, all of these peoples, all three of them, have been told at different times that they do not exist or they should not exist. The Kurds were told in the early days of Republican Turkey that there was no such thing as Kurds, there were mountain Turks. Everybody's a Turk. Kurds are Turks. They were forbidden to teach their own language and otherwise were told that they didn't exist. The links of the Armenians to most of their ancestral homeland were downplayed, monuments were destroyed, and linkages were ruptured. The very existence of the Palestinians, as we know, was also denied. This was most famously expressed in 1969 by Golda Meir, who scoffed, "There's no such thing as a Palestinian." I can't imitate her accent either. "There's no such thing as a Palestinian people. It's not as if we came along and threw them out of their country. They didn't exist." Said that to the Sunday Times. Beyond this, it is the primary victims in all of these sets of events who have been blamed. As the losers have been scapegoated by the victors. The victors have done this mainly by successfully deploying the broad brush of terrorism. In the framing of such matters, of course, certain states never engage in terrorism, whether they're killing innocent civilians by using phosphorus or poison gas or drones or any other means of mass destruction. By a consensus of the powerful, the term terrorism is exclusively restricted to non-state actors who commit violence against civilians. State actors who commit massive violence against civilians under these rules are not terrorists. As a result, entire peoples can be condemned and treated as pariahs, can be effectively excluded from the human community, and subject to any form of inhuman treatment if the terrorist label can successfully be attached to them. This has been done repeatedly in all three of these cases. Finally, with the exception of the tiny state of Armenia, the very names of the countries of these three peoples have been erased from the map, as the victors tried to erase signs of their presence, whether by the destruction of hundreds of villages, as in Palestine, or by other means. Physical erasure, archaeological legerdemain, divide and rule tactics, all of these have been utilized to make the evidence of the existence of these peoples go away. Thus, today, there is no Kurdistan on the map, there is no Palestine on the map. A small state of Armenia exists, but it is the exception. The net effect of the employment of all these tools in the arsenal of the victors has been to compound the original injury and to keep the wounds from healing. It can take generations to overcome mass historical trauma in the best of circumstances. Look at Britain, France, and Germany and World War I, for example. But when there is denial, when it is asserted that the victim has no cause for complaint, or even that the tormentor is the real victim, Israel is the real victim, we are told, then the trauma caused by material and physical hurt is compounded and magnified. Thus, if we ask why these wounds are unhealed, beyond the real grievances, beyond the complicated political issues that must be resolved, there's the hard issue of remapping the way in which these conflicts are understood so as to undo this cruel denial. Dealing with this may be as difficult, dealing with denial may be as difficult as the resolution of the political issues themselves. So deeply embedded is the denial of the national trauma of the Armenians, the Kurds, and the Palestinians in the national narrative of several of the successful nation states of the Middle East. Now, I'm not going to leave you with this depressing litany. Let me close on a slightly less grim note. While we may be far from seeing justice or even recompense for these century-old injuries, there are signs at least that the walls of denial may be beginning to crumble. In Turkey a reconciliation process with the Kurds is very haltingly underway. It goes forward 2 steps and back 2 steps, and then forward 3 and back 2. It remains to be seen if satisfactory terms for Kurdish autonomy can be agreed upon, and it remains to be seen how the precarious situation of Kurds in Iraq and Syria will affect this process or be affected by the process in Turkey. There have been fragile gains for the Kurds in both of those countries, in Iraq and Syria, but the question remains, can a solution for the Kurds be found within the boundaries of the 4 concerned nation states of Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey? Or will the Kurdish question contribute to the dissolution of the post-World War I frontiers that are currently challenged by the so-called Islamic State? The only positive sign is that there is still a process for Kurdish autonomy going on in Turkey. The Armenian question, unfortunately, is not in as hopeful a phase as that of the Kurds. The expectations of some that the ruling AKP, the party of President Erdogan, might lower the wall of denial of Armenian genocide have not been borne out. But we can take heart from something that is going on in Turkey, in Turkish civil society, and deep within the Turkish body politic, Turkish intellectual class. There is going on a process whereby there is an increasing acceptance of the criminal nature of what was done to the Armenian people in World War I, a growing acceptance of genocide. I saw it begin. We had a conference at the University of Chicago about 15 years ago with Turkish and Armenian scholars. It was the first time they had ever gotten together, and since then this has grown and grown and grown, and it's finally beginning to have an impact within Turkish civil society. There are signs that at least parts of the society, if not the state, are coming to terms with the historic burden that Turks have to shoulder of understanding and accepting what was done under Ottoman rule to the Armenian people in the genocide. Similarly heartening has been the increasing acceptance by many people the world over of the facts of the Nakba of 1948. Nakba denial was widespread until very recently. The expulsion, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians are now accepted as historical facts, as things that took place by broader and broader segments of opinion the world over. In the United States even, the place where unreality reigns as far as this issue is concerned, even in Israel to some extent. We are far from witnessing the healing of these wounds that were first opened 100 years ago and that have been exacerbated, as I've said, by denial. For that healing process to take place, for the national aspirations of the Palestinians, of the Kurds and the Armenians to be addressed, much, much more would have to take place. But as little by little we see the walls of denial crumble in each of these 3 cases, we can at least begin to hope that such an outcome, which would embody justice for the Armenian people, justice for the Kurdish people, and justice for the Palestinian people, is a possibility. Thank you very much.
Hello. As a Brit, much maligned in your speech.
Justly maligned.
All right. This is why I wanted to look a little bit at the mechanisms of the production of British policy at that time, which I'm not really conversant with. Can you truly argue that this was kind of conscious duplicity, or is there an argument that there were perhaps different or competing bureaucracies making conflicting pledges, or pure pragmatism, things change, your policies change? I mean, is it actually innate duplicity, or is there a kind of slightly less, I don't know, damning view that you could take?
I think we always get onto slippery ground or thin ice when we talk about intentions, because only God knows the soul of man and woman. All we can talk about is outcomes and the evidence that we have before us. And in the case, at least of Palestine, I think it's well worth reading the entire memo that I referred to by Lord Balfour. Because what he basically says was, we knew exactly what we were doing when we made contradictory pledges. I'm not sure that this was the case in every other one of the commitments that I've talked about by the British. In the case, for example, of the commitments to the Kurds, there's some evidence that the right hand didn't fully know what the left hand was doing with the Armenians. But what Sir Mark Sykes was ordered to do was mandated by the same cabinet that ordered Sir Henry McMahon to write the letters to Sharif Hussein. They knew precisely what they were doing. And that same cabinet included, the cabinet that issued the Balfour Declaration a couple of years later, included several members who had signed off on Sykes-Picot and signed off on Hussein McMahon. So in that case, I think we have to admit at least a high degree of duplicity. The other case is less so. I mean, Balfour's memo is damning about every single thing, not just Palestine, Syria. He says again and again, you know, we say this and we're doing something completely different. We know what we're doing. And it's, you know, it was an internal memo, and I'm not surprised it wasn't released for decades afterwards. There's a question over here. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you, Professor Khalidi. I was struck at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum by a quote justifying the massacre of East European Jews. No one, after all, remembers the genocide of the Armenians.
Hitler.
And that was Hitler.
Yeah.
Israel still refuses to recognize the genocide of the Armenians. Their state, based on their genocide of their own people, they refuse to recognize essentially the inspiration for that genocide with Armenia. I believe my own country, the United States, also refuses to recognize Armenia as a genocide. How important do you think that is, based on your topic, based on the importance you gave on the denial, and also geopolitically, because I know that relations with Turkey are both very important for Israel and the United States. So maybe morally and geopolitically, how important is it to actually call what happened in Armenia a genocide?
I mean, what I've argued is that when you're talking about something that goes back 5 generations, and it is clearly so vivid in the minds and the imaginations of a generation whose grandparents barely remember Armenia or Palestine, clearly you're talking about something more than whatever material hurt happened in 1917 or 1919 or whatever, or 1948 or whatever year. Clearly you're talking about something that's compounded by the way these issues have been treated. And I sincerely believe that denial is not worse than the original crimes that are involved, but enormously magnify these crimes and are one of the things that keep this alive in people's minds. I honestly believe that if the Turkish government were to say, the Ottoman government committed genocide, we are the heirs of the Ottoman government, we apologize for what was done by our forebears. If they said, the people who established the Republic of Turkey included a whole group of people who were senior officers of the Ottoman army who carried out these orders, they would have to go do more than just say, that was them, this is us, which is to some extent true. The Republic is different from the empire. But the backbone that established the Turkish Republic was the Tashkilat-i Makhsusa, which had carried out the massacres. The Secret Service, which built up the arms caches and created the resistance against the Greeks and the British and the French, was the same Secret Service that really did most of the dirty work in the slaughter of the Armenians. They would have to say those things. And I think that would change entirely the way Armenians regard their own history. Because what they know to be true, what the victims and survivors and those who have testified know to be true, or people know from their grandparents to be true, would now be acknowledged by the world. So I actually think it would fundamentally change the situation. Now, you'd still have issues of restitution, recompense, legal, diplomatic, and so on and so forth, but it would entirely change the discussion. And I think that would be true in all of these cases. And I don't think it's just, Turks and Armenians or Israelis and Palestinians. There's an enormous international responsibility here. The international community does its best to dodge its responsibility. The United Nations created the Palestine question after the League of Nations, or I should say, massively exacerbated the Palestine question after the League of Nations at the instigation of the British, created it. So the international community bears a huge responsibility. I mean, where's the Arab state that the United Nations General Assembly mandated? I mean, hello? That was 60, what is that now, 67 years ago, 68 years ago. That still hasn't come into existence. This is an international responsibility, as are all of these other things I'm talking about. It's not just Britain, it's not just the Soviet Union, it's not just the United States, it's the international community as a whole. I think that would be very important. All of this is one, because the other pile is what you just talked about, realpolitik. Why will the United States not talk about genocide? Because of realpolitik, because of the importance of Turkey as a NATO ally and so on and so forth. Why will Israel not recognize the genocide? For similar realpolitik reasons, the importance of its links with Turkey, even under the AKP. They're not willing to use it as a stick to beat Turkey with, even though relations have gotten worse. And you see this most clearly with Kissinger. Kissinger's comment about the Kurds. The Kurds were a stick to beat a Soviet client with, in that case, Iraq. And as soon as that ceased to be important, covert action is not to be confused with missionary work. Other questions? If somebody else has a question, then go ahead. Go ahead. There's somebody in front of you who can ask a question after you.
Yeah, just on American relations with the Kurds, it's worth pointing out, you're right, they sold them out in '75.
Right.
In 2003, for example, they showed a remarkable attachment to the Kurds over their NATO allies, Turkey. They insisted, the Turks wanted to go in with American forces and as part of the price for allowing US forces to go into northern Iraq or into Iraq through Turkey. The Americans stood against that. They said, if you go in with us, you come out with us, because the Turks obviously had their own agenda. And to my surprise, I mean, they actually stood with what they called their Kurdish friends against their Turkish allies. And in fact, they then airlifted their troops in from Jordan rather than going overland through Turkey. And since then, they have shown, to my mind, quite a remarkable attachment and commitment to the Kurds, not least the bombing intervention they're doing on their behalf now. I'm talking about northern Iraq, of course, not in general, but also they're working with the Kurds in northern Syria now as well.
Right.
So just a little historical note there.
Yeah, I would suggest, though, that the instance that you talk about in 2003 is a rather similar example to the 75 one with a different outcome, because in both cases there were important American national interests involved. If Turkey had gone in, Turkey would have tried to create a situation in northern Iraq which would have been to Turkey's advantage and would have probably been to the disadvantage of the United States. Whereas what the United States has created has been a faithful ally that's been useful to the Americans, not least of which in fighting Daesh today. So I think that, you know, it was not the brown eyes of the glittering brown eyes of the Kurdish people that motivated American policymakers in 2003, but hard, cold realpolitik, which in this case has so far worked out to the benefit of the Kurds. You know, you're right. You're absolutely right. But for reasons that are not a moist-eyed, dreamy idealism in Washington, it doesn't really exist. There was someone else who had a hand up here. Yeah.
Hi, Rashid.
Kifak.
كيف حالك? I agree with your observation that the walls of denial are crumbling, but this is largely due to the struggle of the peoples concerned. You know, let's take, for example, the Kurdish case. I think Kurdish self-determination is within reach with the crumbling fascist regimes of Syria and Iraq. You know, I think it's within grasp, but simply because the Kurds were fighting since 1922 a permanent state of armed struggle, you know, against different imperialist and local reactionary forces. This is I really see a ray of hope for the Kurds, at least. But for the Palestinians, I would like you to comment on the PA and Hamas's negative role in pressing forward with the question of Palestinian self-determination. Thank you, Rashid.
Just 3 points. Firstly, I agree with you. In each case, these walls of denial are crumbling essentially because of the efforts of these peoples themselves. I mean, the Armenians have pushed their case effectively. The Kurds have pushed their case effectively, and it's been supporters of the Palestinians outside, mainly of Palestine, who've done an amazing job in pushing in knocking down the walls of denial. I agree with you. As to whether Kurdish independence is within grasp, I don't think this story has fully played itself out. I mean, you may be right, but I would very much question not the nature of these regimes. I'm not talking about the nature of the Turkish regime or the Syrian regime or the Iranian regime or the Iraqi regime.
Being in the forefront of fighting ISIL, especially, they're needed by everybody.
But what I'm saying is that I would suggest that the post-World War I nation states, artificial though they were in many respects in their creation and weak though they are now in some respects, may have more life in them than you suggest. I'm just saying that I'm not quite yet ready to count them out. But I'm a historian. I can't talk about the future. I can talk about the past. Up to now, this is what I see. As far as the Hamas and the Ramallah Sulta, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, I mean, I don't know what you want me to say. I've written on these people again and again and again. I think they both do a disservice to the Palestinian people by a number of things. One of them being keeping the Palestinian Authority alive. Palestinian Authority is the most important prop of the occupation. It's as important as military force, and it's as important as covert means used by the Shabak to keep the population under control. In fact, in some respects, it's the most important means. Absent that means, Israel would have much greater difficulty maintaining its colonization and its occupation and control of the Palestinians. And both are wedded to a continuation of the Palestinian Authority in different ways and for different reasons, in Ramallah and in Gaza. I think they do a huge disservice by failing to recognize that dividing the weaker party in the face of a stronger enemy is a guarantee of defeat. You can't win. A weaker actor can't possibly remain divided in the face of a larger, stronger enemy. There's no military moltke, no strategist in the history of mankind has ever argued that the weaker force should divide itself and that it can win. You have to be unified in this kind of struggle, and you have to have a strategy. And the Palestinian division and the lack of a strategy are catastrophic weaknesses for the Palestinian national movement. In fact, I would argue the Palestinian national movement is again at one of its lower phases. It reminds me in some respects of the period after 1948. So I have few good words to say about either of these two leaderships. In fact, I have no good words to say about them. There are two people with hands raised over here.
She has the microphone.
Go ahead, whichever one is first. Go ahead.
I was wondering if you had an example for us of where a nation has committed something terrible and has come forward, and that has sped along the healing. And I was actually thinking about Germany and how it has made a big effort to accept its atrocities. And I'm wondering if you think that has made a big difference in how the Jewish people have healed. Because my sense, at least in America, is that wound is really alive, and they keep it alive, despite Germany's efforts to kind of move forward.
You're right that the wound is alive, and it is kept alive. But I think that what Germany did, which was to fully recognize its responsibility for the Holocaust, did certainly change the way Jews looked at Germany. It ended that. I mean, I remember a time when people in the United States that I knew wouldn't buy a German car, wouldn't go to Germany. I once had the experience of flying out of Ben Gurion Airport on a Lufthansa plane that was packed with Israelis who had no problems with going to Germany. So that has completely changed. Now, has the trauma of the Holocaust disappeared as a result? No. For one thing, it's not 5 generations old. It's only 2 generations old. For another thing, it's exploited. I mean, the best work on this is by a former colleague of mine, Peter Novick, The Holocaust in American Life. And there's some wonderful books on the way the Holocaust is exploited in Israel as well. There's also Norman Finkelstein's book, The Holocaust Industry, but I would strongly recommend the Novick book, The Holocaust in American Life, which is a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant analysis of how the Holocaust came to be discovered in American life. There was no Holocaust. The term didn't exist in the 50s and the early 60s. The term was developed, and Holocaust consciousness was developed in the 1960s. In fact, memory of the Holocaust was suppressed both in Israel and in the American Jewish community. I remember talking to people whose families had lost members, and young people like me, kids, teenagers, would ask the adults, well, what happened? They wouldn't talk. Nobody would talk about it. And something changes in the 60s, and Novick is by far the best. He was a great historian, Peter. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. And it was linked to the rise of the idea that the American Jewish community's existence is linked to Israel. Holocaust consciousness and a linkage to Israel develop in fundamentally different ways at more or less the same time in the 60s. And then the 67 war ties it all together. The idea that Israel was in danger of annihilation is central to the consciousness of every American Zionist over the age of about 40. They believe it because it was pounded into them. I'm looking at documents now. Abba Eban said this in the Security Council almost every day. And the Israeli government was talking about it all the time. This is another Holocaust. This is going to be another Holocaust. They're going to destroy Israel. We now know from the American documents that have been released that it was the estimation of both the American intelligence community and the American military that Israel would destroy the Arab armies even if the Arab armies attacked first. Israel would smash all Arab countries put together, irrespective of who attacked first. Israel had no chance of being defeated, let alone being annihilated. The Americans knew this. The Israeli military probably knew this. But Israeli politicians, either consciously or because they themselves believed it, really, really wielded this fear. And that cemented the connection between the Holocaust and Israel, in the American consciousness at least. That's Novick's analysis, and I personally am convinced of it.
My question is, why did they choose the Armenians and the Kurds not to give them a state? Is it
the British?
Because of the territory on which they are, or is it to do with that it's more difficult to divide them afterwards on religious grounds because they are more national rather than religious as a group?
I think it was basically force majeure. Had the Allied powers been able to ensure the outcome that they wanted, which is the partition of Turkey, such that there would be a very tiny Turkish rump state that would be weak, defenseless, in this one small part of Anatolia, and had other parts of Anatolia remained under the control of the French, of the Italians, of the Greeks, of the British, and of these smaller states that they were hoping to create, a Kurdish state and an Armenian state, that would have been an ideal outcome from their point of view. Divide and rule, imperial, spoils at the end of the war. There were all kinds of benefits from the perspective of the imperialists like Churchill and Curzon and Balfour and Lloyd George, who ran Britain, and Clemenceau and so on and so forth, who ran France at this time, during and after World War I. But Ataturk and the Turkish Republic prevented that from happening. It was not a British preference that the Armenians and the Kurds the Armenians be completely denied any state and be driven into a tiny piece of Armenia, or that the Kurds be subsumed in the Turkish Republic. It was their inability to stop Ataturk, and the inability of their Greek allies to stop Ataturk that led to that outcome. So the Turks themselves, or the nascent Turkish Republic, basically imposed the outcome. It wasn't a British preference. They did not want that. They were very unhappy with that. But they had no choice, because at the end of World War I, Britain was A, dependent on the United States financially, and B, the British population was weary of war. I mean, they had just lost 4 million people. The last thing they wanted was to fight the Bolsheviks in Russia and Ataturk in Anatolia. And so they made a number of compromises in Egypt, in Iraq, and in other places that had to do with not not really having the forces to maintain the empire or the money. So it wasn't their preference. They had no choice. There's someone behind you, yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I had more of a historiographical question, just about less about Kurds in Kurdistan and Armenia, but in the case of Palestine, while there's of course great importance for these large international agreements and promises, I was very convinced by more Marxist arguments in Palestine about how the origin of the conflict there was more about early Zionist domination of labor and they're wanting to end the nascent creation of a class system with Jews being in a higher position than Arabs. I just wonder if you had any comment on that.
Well, I think you have to distinguish between what the Zionists thought they were doing, what they said they were doing, what they were actually doing, and between what the British said they were doing and what the British were actually doing. So the British had their own objectives in this, which involved using Zionism, and which paid very little attention to the specific nature of Zionism, which had to do with World War I war aims of the British Empire, which had to do with a sort of veiled anti-Semitism on the part of some British leaders and philo-Semitism on the part of others, sometimes the two things in the same person. Had to do with passionate Zionism on the part of some British leaders. Churchill was one of the greatest Zionists of the 20th century, for example. And that's completely different from what the Zionists were doing and what they thought they were doing and said they were doing. Zionism was a colonial project, which was of a specific type. Some colonial projects utilize, exploit not just the resources of the colonized territory, but also the population. Zionism was a settler colony, like Canada, like New Zealand, Australia, the United States. By the way, Canada is another example of a case where there's really been a serious attempt to address what was done after all of the almost all the indigenous people were destroyed, but still. And so, in the case of Palestine, what the Zionist movement was trying to do was, as the great book by Gershon Shafir shows, trying to replace Arab labor with avodah ivrit, Hebrew labor. And that was a nominally socialist, but really nationalist operation, which was only possible because of one of the highest levels of capital inflow per capita in the history of capital, in the 20s especially. That more capital was coming in than the GDP of the Jewish economy in most years of the 20s. I mean, think about that. Think if more capital were coming into Lebanon annually than the GDP of Lebanon. I mean, the place would be awash with money. You'd have Mercedes and Range Rovers and Maseratis in all the streets. In fact, you actually do, now that I think of it. I'm not sure you have greater capital inflow than the GDP. In the case of the Yishuv, of the economy of the Yishuv, that's what was happening. So this socialist experiment was floated on vast seas of capital on a per capita basis, with the objective of creating an insulated colonial settler society, which succeeded. But does that answer your question? Get him the microphone so he can. Shafir, yeah. It's a great book.
I guess my question was more, I mean, seeing that on the ground flow of capital,
right,
as maybe more influential than these large international agreements.
Both were necessary.
Yeah.
Both were necessary.
Yeah.
If you'd had what Jabotinsky called an iron wall of British bayonets, and you hadn't had Zionism as an ideology, anti-Semitism in Europe, immigrants, and capital, the project wouldn't have worked. Just the British holding down the Arabs would have led to the same kind of result as the British and the French trying to hold down Arabs in Egypt and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon would have had. Ultimately, you would have had some kind of independent state. It might not have been a really independent state, but you would have had an independent. The colonial project depended on both. Depended on the British carrying out their part of the deal, as it were, for their own reasons. Had nothing to do with Had nothing to do with, the brown eyes of the Zionist leaders. Entirely to suit British imperial interests. And as soon as those interests changed on the eve of World War II, the British said, okay, we've finished our commitment. Here's the white paper. In 10 years, the project is over. You wanted a Jewish national home? You've got a national home. End of project, bye. And because their interests changed. They had to fight World War II. They couldn't tie down 2.5 divisions of troops holding the Arabs down to suit the Zionists. They needed them elsewhere. And they couldn't have all the Arabs in Cairo and Damascus and Beirut who were furious, and Baghdad and Amman who were furious at what their British were doing, continue to be furious when those areas were going to be battlefields in World War II, as Western Egypt was, as some parts of the Levant were. So the British, followed their interest, as powers do. Any other questions? There's somebody there and somebody, sorry.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. If you don't mind me asking a few questions that bounce off your book, Resurrecting Empire, which I just finished. You had an interesting section about the experts, the role of experts in American versus British imperialism.
Yeah.
And at some point, I felt like the experts in Britain who, lobbied for indirect rule in Iraq and Egypt, in a way maintained the control of Britain over Iraq and Egypt, and you elsewhere also argued that it hindered democracy, while in the future, while in the States, totally kind of ideological orientation to Iraq. I wonder I couldn't tell from the book which is better, because you mentioned the hubris of American diplomacy, yet at the same time the intelligence of the British is what kind of maintained these kind of forces.
Absolutely.
And so it seems like there's a catch-22, if we have experts, then they'll somehow get better control. But if they're just ideologically motivated, they're going to destroy the country or something, and then I'm not sure what would follow, but the death, a lot of death, a lot of pain. So I'm not sure, how do you see the role of expert today, and what to do about that? That's my first. And second...
Why don't you let me answer that, and then you can ask the second one.
Oh, okay.
Because
sure.
I'm just so that I can remember everything here. You've exactly described it. What you just said exactly reflects my argument. The expertise that the British mobilized in a whole series of people, both those who were on the ground like Gertrude Bell and Lawrence and so on and so forth, and others in the imperial center who actually knew what they were talking about. They had actually fought in this area. Kitchener, Curzon, and so on, had actually been in the Middle East. They actually knew the place. Some of them, Kitchener knew Turkish and Arabic. And the expertise of the ones on the ground meant, and you said, is it good or bad? It was good for British imperial interests. It wasn't good for the peoples of the area, obviously. Was the ignorance of the people in the Bush administration who did what I described, utterly destroyed everything that had been done in the way of state building in Iraq for more than a century and a half, created a sectarian constitution, and so on and so forth and so on, put a horrific regime in power in Baghdad. Was this good for the Iraqis? Obviously it wasn't. It also wasn't good for the United States, it turns out. But this is not a judgmental, this is an assessment of reality. On the one hand, the British were smart imperialists. They did things that served the imperial interest, I wouldn't say the national, the imperial interest of the British Empire. The Americans were fumbling, bumbling, the Bush administration in particular, fools who had no idea what they were doing. And in fact, as I say in the book, there was a systematic exclusion of expertise at every level in order to ensure this outcome, whether in the Pentagon or whether in the State Department or whether in the intelligence services. So your second question.
Yes, it relates to the notion of Iraq as a failed state. You made the argument that Iraq could be classified as a failed state, not only because of the American intervention, but also because of Saddam Hussein's vicious policies.
Right.
In a sense, you kind of said that a failed state is a brutal state. There was like a half sentence like that, followed by the American intervention. I wonder to what extent, and then you called for, the international kind of solution to Iraq, a new mandate, an international mandate that would be better than the unilateral American approach.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say the same about Palestine and Israel? Could you say that Israel and Palestine is a failed state, and the international community was the one that created it, therefore we should send peacekeeping forces and have an international group of powers that go in to, do the same as you would have proposed for Iraq? Yet in the book, the Palestinian solution you proposed was a bit different. It involved negotiations and a more two-party approach. So that's my I was wondering if you could classify Palestine as a failed state given the vicious cycles of violence that continue today.
Well, the two things I want to say. First of all, I wrote this book 12 years ago. I wrote this book before the invasion, and it came out after the American invasion. So I was writing it in 2001, 2002, and it was published, I think, in 2004. And so I was dealing with a moving target. And if I were to write the book again, I would probably write it very differently, as far as Iraq is concerned. And Iraq, as I said in the book, was a failed state partly because of Saddam's policy, his attack on Iran, and then his attack on Kuwait. And partly because of American policies, like especially the sanctions regime, which did more to destroy Iraq in some respects than the actual invasion did, though, or as much in some respects. And that left the field open for the people that Bremer brought in and the U.S. military to dismantle everything that was there. I now think that had a different policy been followed under the occupation, you might have had a slightly different outcome. And then I've come to think very much more carefully about the comparison between what the United States did in Iraq and what it did in Japan and Germany after World War II. Japan and Germany were totally devastated by American and British bombing in the case of Germany and American bombing in the case of Japan. And all the United States did was to take the very tip of the pyramid off. Denazification only went down a couple of levels, to the very top levels of the state. Industry was not touched. The intelligence service was picked up and taken and attached to the American intelligence service. The whole Gehlen network, the whole anti-Soviet network of the German intelligence was picked up and incorporated into the American intelligence service. And the rest of the state wasn't touched. There was no denazification down to the level of everyone who'd been a member of the Nazi party. Same kind of policy was followed in Japan. Tojo and a few other people were shot. And that was it. Had the United States done to those two countries what was done to Iraq in terms of removing absolutely everybody who knew how to do anything because they'd been a member of the Ba'ath Party, or who had ever had any position because they'd been a member of the Ba'ath Party, which is the policy of the current Iraqi government as inspired by the United States, and they have their own reasons now for continuing to do this. Had that been done to Germany and Japan, they would not be the great economic powers they are today. They would not be the strong states that they are today. You could not have had a reconstruction of Germany had that been done. Had everybody who was a member of the Nazi Party been banned forever from involvement in anything, just imagine. So what was done was really quite devastating to Iraq. Had a somewhat different policy been followed, I'm not sure what would have happened. It's hard to tell. As Israel, Palestine, and Palestine. Palestinians have never had a state. Palestinians have had a parastate. The PLO was a parastate. It's now in complete disrepair. The PA, at best, is a parastate. It's actually not a parastate. It's really a branch of the occupation. So the Palestinians have been systematically denied from not just having statehood, but having most of the apparatuses of state. The closest they came to it was this state within a state, which partly helped to feed the Lebanese civil war, because it was on another people's territory. You can't do that. Israel is a very successful state. Israel is one of the most successful states in modern history. I mean, I think that it is a phenomenon out of its time. I don't think it's possible in the 21st century to have a successful colonial settler project. Ultimately, it has to fail for that reason alone. There are many other reasons. But that doesn't mean it's not an enormously successful state. And it's not just a colonial settler project. Like all nation states, it has enormous elements of artificiality to it. In this case, more artificial than most, but they're all artificial, really. France is artificial. I hate to say this. Is there anybody French here? It's artificial. I forget who it was, Montaigne or somebody, goes down to Aix-en-Provence in 1700. These are savages. These people don't even speak French. These people, I don't know what they're saying. They spoke Provençal. They didn't speak French. It wasn't that France didn't exist as we think it existed back to the time of Joan of Arc, back to the time of Vercingetorix. This is all mythology. The same is true with every nation state. The only question is, when does the myth take? Myth takes, in the case of France, probably Napoleon Republic, somewhere around there. Britain, 1680. It doesn't matter. They're all artificial. Israel is artificial, but it's a nation state, even though it's a colonial settler project. I hate to break it to people who can't, chew gum and walk at the same time, can't understand that it's a colonial settler project and a nation state, but they might look at the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Those are major, important, successful nation states. The United States is the most powerful state in world history. Very successful. Colonial settler project, but it worked. They extirpated most of the indigenous population, imposed themselves. End of discussion. Israel is not a 17th or a 16th or an 18th century or even a 19th century project. It's a 20th, 21st century. You can't do that in the 21st century. So it is a successful state, a very successful state, one of the most successful states on earth, in my view. That doesn't mean that I think it can last, because you can't do that anymore. And the seeds of its own at least transformation, but are there as a result. ما في حدا بده يسأل. في يمكن اثنين.
أنا عندي سؤال.
في أربعة.
إذا بتسمح لي.
أنا بسمح لك.
أعزبك.
Maybe this is the last question, because I see people.
I hate to
answer. لا. اتفضل.
I want to go back to your fascinating core argument, which is the kind of parallelisms and the heuristic value of kind of comparisons, and the idea that all these three cases are unhealed wounds of World War I. Can we go one extra level of abstraction in a way and say that all of these also belong to a wider network of unhealed wounds of post-imperial states, for example, that are common to a wider geopolitical order, perhaps, and therefore, and if we go to that extra level of abstraction, is the state, the modern nation state, a possible solution to those wounds, or are these wounds precisely an outcome of the hegemony of the nation-state form, and therefore the solutions may be elsewhere too? Thank you.
Good point. Good question. You would expect that of someone with a Columbia PhD. No, you're absolutely right. These wounds are a result of other more successful nation states inflicting them on these three peoples. And I'm not suggesting anywhere in my talk, I didn't say statehood or self-determination. No, I know you know, but I just want to point that out to the audience. I talked about justice and recompense and healing the wounds. Sure, when and if the straitjacket of the nation state is overcome, in whatever way that may happen, through, who knows, the victory of an Islamic State, through, who knows, the victory of untrammeled neoliberal capital, as you see in the European Union and trade agreements that the United States is peddling all over the world. When the nation state, in other words, is really, has it really shriveled, when and if it shrivels, as a result of these or other processes that we can't foresee. Sure, I can see the Armenians and the Kurds and the Palestinians walking happily into some bright new future, which doesn't include nation states and self-determination. But I mean, the demise of nationalism has been one of the most over-anticipated eventualities in modern history. Poor Benedict Anderson, when he wrote, what's it called, his book? Imagined Communities, the preface talks about his disillusionment that proletarian internationalism was shown to be false by the war between Vietnam and China. He was hoping that that would overcome nationalism. He said, okay, I guess it's not going to be overcome. Maybe I better write about nationalism. I mean, the result is a very good book. But he's right. We're stuck with it. So I honestly think that it's going to be very, very hard, in the Palestinian case in particular, to envisage a situation where there can be an easy national self-determined solution. In other words, I don't think what I thought in 2001 when I wrote that book that you're referring to, Resurrecting Empire, that it might be possible to have an easy self-determination outcome for the Palestinians. I don't think that's possible, frankly, or almost impossible, if it's not totally impossible. And I disagree with you, George. I'm not so sure about the Kurds either. I think that one underestimates the elasticity and the staying power of all four of those nation states if one assumes that the Kurds can actually carve an independent, sovereign nation state that will enter the United Nations and will incorporate all the Kurds. It could happen. I mean, all of those states could crumble tomorrow. I wouldn't bet my pension on it, however. In particular, the Turkish state and the Iranian state. Those two don't look to me like they're going anywhere. And that's the problem with what you're talking about, Ali. That straitjacket is just, it's very potent, very powerful. States have things like holidays, postage stamps, indoctrinating little 5-year-olds in nursery school through the rest of education, armies, and all of these means of forging a national consciousness, which means teaching people a bunch of lies, mainly. Israel is so obvious as in terms of the way in which this is forged, that we think, oh, that's a real artificial. It's not it's just the most extreme case. Look at Turkey. Look at any state that really has been enormously successful in creating this powerful chauvinism out of nothing. It didn't exist 60, 70, 80, 90 years ago, whatever the case may be. They're all like that, in a sense. Some are more successful than others. So yeah, I don't really think it's going to be very easy. There is in Armenia. They're the only ones who actually have a nation state of the three peoples I've talked about, which is a fraught, difficult, almost impossible, in a fraught, difficult, and almost impossible situation. But in some ways, the Armenian diaspora is more of Armenia than Armenia is. In other words, the Armenians form a people wherever they are, irrespective of the fact most of them are not in Armenia and don't really particularly want to go there except to visit or whatever. Which is an interesting question about peoplehood that doesn't have to do with statehood. That's another question. The same is true with Palestinians and the Kurds, of course. Kifaya?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rashid, for a very rich, interactive,
thank you,
full of themes. And sorry, we have to stop the questions. Thanks again.
They can come up and ask me afterwards.
Yeah.
Shukran.